Hello, and welcome to today's program, Korean Peninsula Update with the NK News team. Thank you all for joining us. My name is Chelsea Alexander, and I'm the Policy Program Officer here at the Korea Society. We're pleased to welcome the NK News team here today from Seoul to help us understand the latest developments unfolding in North and South Korea. So please allow me to briefly introduce our esteemed guests. Chad O'Carroll is the founder of NK News, NK Pro, and the related holding company Korea Risk Group. He's a frequent writer and commentator about the Koreas. Jeongmin Kim is a correspondent at NK News and editorial director at Korea Pro. She covers inter-Korean relations and North and South Korean foreign and military affairs. Shreyas Reddy is the lead correspondent at NK News. He previously worked as a researcher at BBC Monitoring, where he focused on Korean Peninsula, Japan, Southeast Asia, and the Pacific. And Colin Zwirko is a senior analytic correspondent for NK News. He received a master's degree in international security and foreign policy from South Korea's Yonsei University. Thank you all for joining us. We're excited to hear from all of you today. But before we jump in, I want to thank the Korea Foundation and our corporate sponsors, the names of which are prominently displayed in the lobby, for making this program possible. And thank you for our in-house and virtual audience. We'll provide an opportunity for in-person attendees to ask questions directly. And for our virtual audience, please send your questions throughout the program to policy@koreasociety.org. And with that, I'll turn it over to Jonathan.
Thank you very much, Chelsea. Thank you to our in-person audience, and thank you to our panelists who've come a long way here from Seoul. And happy St. Patty's Day. If you could hear the faint beat of bagpipes in the background there, that's the parade over on Fifth Avenue. So maybe afterwards we can all go march in the parade. Thanks for joining us, taking the big trip. And NK News, a source of fantastic insights, and now Korea Pro pointed at South Korea as well. So, so much to get to. Very excited for today's conversation. As Chelsea mentioned, if you're watching virtually, and over 200 people have signed up to do so, you could send those questions in. We will prioritize those folks who are the Korea Society members. So if you're interested in membership, we're happy to help facilitate that. And we already have a couple questions sent in from members, including Terrence Rohrig. So excited to get to those. Chad, let's start with you. We want to look big picture. And when I think historically about the Korean Peninsula, every time there's been an inflection point, it's been because of these larger geopolitical forces. Korea's colonization by Japan, division, trusteeship, the Korean War, the Cold War era locked into this ideological battle with their supporting patron states. And when there have been changes around that geopolitical environment, that's impacted Korea very much so. Perhaps I'm wrong, but it feels like to me today there are similar geopolitical forces changing and swirling around the Korean Peninsula that could induce some sort of change. So can you talk us through how you're looking at things right now?
Yeah, good morning. So first of all, thanks very much for the invitation. We're very happy to be here. For me, the thing I'm watching most right now is US-Russia. Obviously, the last 2-3 years, North Korea has built a very close relationship with Russia. And they're fundamentally, this is really a military relationship. They're providing munitions, they're providing men. There's been a lot of talk of special technology transfers between the two countries. And overnight, theoretically, a lot of this Russia-DPRK military cooperation could come to an end, because if the war ends in Ukraine, Russia theoretically is not going to need this level of support from North Korea. So I think this could have quite profound consequences for the North Korea portfolio. Firstly, Kim Jong-un is looking at what's going on with Ukraine and these US concessions to Russia on recognizing changes to territory, no NATO membership for Ukraine. And he's probably thinking, well, if I was to get into another negotiation with the Trump administration, perhaps they would recognize our nuclear weapons status. And in fact, Trump has talked, at least on 2 occasions since becoming president now, of North Korea being a quote-unquote nuclear power. The other thing is, I think Russia, going into these negotiations with the Trump administration, may themselves be promoting diplomacy with North Korea as a kind of secondary goal to all of this. Firstly, Russia has included North Korea in its troops. So North Korea is part of this conflict, like it or not, even though it's not officially recognized. And we've recently heard the Russian ambassador in Pyongyang, Matsugora, talking positively about the idea of renewed US DPRK negotiation. So I think there's a lot of reasons we could see North Korea become a new goal of pursuit for the Trump administration for further diplomacy. However, all this being said, I think the South Koreans and Japanese will be looking at this with some trepidation, just in the way that we've recently had Hegseth tell NATO partners to increase their military spending to 5%. I could easily imagine a bilateral negotiation between Trump and Kim Jong-un resulting in quite severe consequences for US military support to South Korea. And for Japan, whose main goals are the abduction issue and maintaining a strong sanctions posture, I don't think the US would potentially take those concerns directly to the top of their agenda if there is a renewal in talks.
Yeah.
So I think fundamentally what we're seeing between Russia and the US and the way that Trump has approached one-to-one personal diplomacy with Putin could offer a kind of template for a renewed set of negotiations between North Korea and the US. So yeah, I think this is what we should be watching right now.
And where's China in all this? Because, of course, North Korea had depended on China, and that was a source of unwelcome leverage from the North Korean point of view, right? But now having the ability to play these two off of one another, these two sponsors in Russia and China, privileges North Korea to kind of be in the catbird seat. Whereas before they were pivoting between Washington and China, now they've got Russia and China, just like the good old days during the Cold War. So has China kind of gotten lost in the shuffle? Is it hard for them to achieve their strategic priorities vis-a-vis the peninsula with all these changes going on?
Well, I think there's a lot of evidence to suggest China has not been happy about the way North Korea's relationship with Ukraine has evolved. You know, one former Russian diplomat, Georgi Toloroya, on our podcast, I think he described it as if China was to go to Belarus and start making loads of deals within Russia's sphere of influence, this would not be well appreciated by the Russian side. So I think it's like a kind of similar to that.
Yeah.
But China still is North Korea's main trading partner. The trade flows have increased quite substantially from the pandemic. So it doesn't seem to be trickling into any problems there just yet. But I think from the US perspective, with this new administration, some of Trump's inner circles seemingly being most concerned about long-term geostrategic competition with China, actually there could be an argument to that could incentivize talks with North Korea to some degree. If the US could peel North Korea off China to an extent, that could be in longer term, broader US strategic interests.
Right.
So,
and alleviate perhaps the chance of a two-front war in Asia, which is something that is a nightmare that needs to be prepared for and planned for. But if diplomacy can achieve mitigation of that, that would be a welcome aim.
Yeah. But the non-proliferation treaty, if there is an imperfect deal and North Korea is in some way informally recognized, you know, when Trump recently talked about Kim Jong-un being a nuclear power, within the same 2-3 sentences, he talked about India and Pakistan.
Yeah.
And that would imply that there may be some interest on the US side in doing something similar to the sanctions relief India and Pakistan received maybe 20 years ago.
Right, right.
So
what is there a significance to you mentioned an informal recognition of North Korea as a nuclear power compared to the status quo right now, which is that the U.S. is committed to working towards denuclearization, but after 3 decades of diplomacy hasn't been able to do it?
Right. I mean, you could argue that there is already informal recognition of North Korea as a nuclear power, but it hasn't translated into sanctions relief or changes to sanctions infrastructure. So I think for the North Koreans, they would expect a big bowl of concessions from the US to start any process, given what happened in Hanoi and the embarrassment of that. And it would, I think it could be framed as a long-term bilateral interest in global disarmament or something like that. Like North Korea will denuclearize when the US does. Like that would probably be the Pyongyang's preference. I don't know if that's realistic, but I'm very excited to see how the US moves after this Russia stuff, whether North Korea will be a top priority and we might see that unfinished business from 2019 resolved.
Right, right. And worth mentioning that we did see a joint statement come out from the US, Japan, and South Korea committing to denuclearization of North Korea, not of the
Which was a
Korean
change.
Peninsula,
Yeah.
right? So, which is,
That wasn't what was agreed at Singapore.
right,
It was the
exactly.
Korean
So
Peninsula.
perhaps offering something that can be bargained away later. So a lot of talk about what are the signals being sent out to North Korea. I want to open up to the rest of our panel now for any additional follow-on thoughts
Can I
on that
actually
one.
ask a question to Chad?
Mhm.
You predicted earlier this year in an NK Pro briefing, a bold prediction that there would be a summit between Kim Jong-un and Trump, one way or another. But remember 2018-19, the discussion was like sanctions lifting versus to Yeongbyon, right?
Yeah.
But what are the motivations now for Trump and Kim to sort of move into that summit? Is it for Kim rather than sanctions? Is it like nuclear power, recognition? But from Trump, what would be the actual motivation?
I think Trump, we've seen time and time again that his approach to foreign policy seems to be interested in doing what no other leaders have done. And so I think if he could have the optics of some kind of big summit meeting in Pyongyang or maybe even Wonsan Kalma, where there is some superficial deal done, I mean, I think he would be personally
Like personal
interested.
victory.
Yeah. And for Kim Jong-un, like going back to what I said about this Russia-Ukraine potential ceasefire, end of hostilities, that is going to have a huge impact on DPRK-Russia relations, which have been North Korea's like main economic growth, I think, in the last 2-3 years has come from Russia. And if that all ends pretty much overnight, I mean, if you subtract the military cooperation that the two have been doing, I mean, what can North Korea reasonably offer to Russia? Like consumer goods, textiles. Russian consumers are not going to be interested in that. Russian tourists don't really want to visit North Korea in large numbers. So Kim Jong-un does need to start thinking about other potential partners to not just be reliant on China. And we were talking about this earlier. An interesting place this could play out is in Moscow in May when there's Victory Day celebrations that Kim Jong-un may be attending. If Trump was to go there, you could have a very interesting trilateral meeting.
Indeed.
We'll see.
Indeed. Yeah, Colin.
I would disagree with Chad that such cooperation would
And
end
what a good
overnight.
NK News corporate culture where you do have this kind of disagreement.
It's every Monday for us like this, but go ahead.
I don't think such cooperation would end overnight. I think that they've codified this in their agreement that they made. I think that they have gotten to know each other where they can help each other in the military sphere. And I think that's actually a challenge for the American potential negotiators. You're not just like having to bring up that old list about all the nuclear sites. Now you have to talk about all of the potential factories where Russia is helping, the drone situation. I mean, I can talk about it in my section. I brought some pictures and stuff, but I think they are happy with what they have built in the last couple of years, and I don't see why either side would want to end that immediately.
But Russia wouldn't theoretically need such vast munition supplies from North Korea if the war ends. Like, and the missiles, the solid fuel missiles it's been purchasing from DPRK, that would presumably end.
It's a question. I mean, Russia has their well-established production industry for missiles and stuff, but what if they found a cheaper option that they can transition to or supplement or rebuild stocks?
Certainly an additional challenge for negotiators, right? Whereas the argument has been made that diplomatic rapprochement is worth it, even if an agreement is not reached, because there is this tendency for North Korea to scale down the provocations, right? The nuclear missile testing and other sorts of kinetic provocations.
South Korea was doing the provocations most recently.
Yeah, I wouldn't call those provocations always, but
drone, not a provocation.
No, the missile tests.
Oh, right.
That's what I
So you're specifically talking about, Chad, the drone incursion, which is still a little murky to me. I don't really understand what happened there.
I think it was, Jeongmin can probably talk about this more.
Well, may I?
Yes,
the
please.
drone incursion, you mean the most recent one?
Yeah,
from South
yeah.
Korea
And if
to
you
the
could give a little
north.
background for our audience.
Just a quick short version is North Korea one day out of nowhere claimed that there were South Korea drones that were in Pyongyang with leaflets, anti-regime leaflets. And then
Yeah.
South Korea at the time commented that it's not worth commenting on and kept pushing for that talking point. And then after the December 3rd martial law, the prosecutors started investigating into not just the martial law aspect, but the motivation and key man of the martial law and everyone involved in that, and belatedly found out through certain former commanders' notes that it was actually true that the defense minister at the time instructed the drone to send the South Korean drones into Pyongyang.
And the purpose is to invite some sort of response that would then justify the martial law?
Well, that is one type of interpretation from politicians and experts, but at the time, it looks like they were trying to retaliate to a certain statement, what they saw as North Korea escalation. They had their own justification.
Right.
But like you said, it's still murky.
And this is in the context of the balloon wars, which were going on at that time.
Yes,
as well.
balloon wars beforehand, and then at the end, it was not just trash in the balloons, but there were anti-Yun leaflets as well. Also, there were a lot of satellite launches throughout the year that South Korea sort of described as quote-unquote provocation, and a lot of war of words as well.
Okay, and this is a good opportunity for us to pivot to you, Jeongmin, because you have been doing a great job covering South Korea, a new part of your
And
portfolio.
I already mentioned martial law.
Yes, so we're all teed up here. We were expecting in the planning of this program that we might have a verdict from the Constitutional Court by today, but alas, we do not, perhaps later this week or even later. So can you take us through what do you think is most likely to happen? We'll have an election within 60 days of the ruling. So who is the leading candidate? What do you think is most likely to occur? And how does it affect the U.S.-Korea relationship, inter-Korean relations, that sort of thing?
It's very difficult to predict on something like this also, especially if it touches on potential election results, right? But all I can really point to is data points so far, public opinion polls. I know there has been a lot of public doubts about public opinion because all the polls would say different things. But it's important to look at time progression, sort of trends of the polls rather than the number itself. And so far, I'll get there. But first of all, when it comes to ruling scenarios, initially, people thought that there would be a ruling around today, actually, earlier in March. But it does look like the justices are taking their time. In South Korea, it's a tradition. It's not in the rule, but it's a tradition that the Constitutional Court justices would aim at unanimous ruling to show that, Constitution is not a realm of too much interpretation. It's something that governs, rule of law, basically. So they're taking their time, and there are just a lot of legal experts and media headlines that are speculating on the result. But let me just walk you through scenarios based on the different results. If if the impeachment is upheld, there would be he would be removed from the post immediately, and there would be an election within 60 days. That would put us at mid-May or late May if the ruling is further away. And currently, if you look at public opinion polls, there have been a few weeks in January, starting January 3rd, week 3, when there was Yoon arrest. That was a big moment for the conservatives in South Korea to consolidate. At the time, the People Power Party, ruling Conservative Party, started trending up. So their support went up. So people started speculating, maybe it's possible that PPP might actually win a presidential election. But now it's down again, and the gap is narrowing down further. Real Meter, Gallup, and NBS are the three main polls that I look at. And it looks like the Democratic Party recently, especially since the Democratic Party leader Lee Jae-myung described himself as centrist conservative. And actually went for a lot of pro-business, sort of not redistribution sort of policies. Actually, the centrist moderates went back to support the Democratic Party in the past few weeks, although
trying
it's
to distance himself from Moon Jae-in,
especially that. It looks like if you look at Lee's recent Economist interview, not Joseon, but other interviews, he is positioning himself as a pro-security, pro-US sort of pragmatic leader, self-proclaimed
Yeah.
pragmatic leader. And it does look like it was a domestic liability, political pressure for him to be kept being painted as pro-China, pro-North Korea, pro-Russia sort of politician from the conservatives. I think he wanted to move away from that.
Yeah.
So he is very directly saying that Democratic Party won't be using the term balancing between the U.S. and China anymore. It would be U.S.-centered pragmatic policies based on issues.
Yeah.
And he also said that South Korea should not be afraid of Japanese defense spending going up because South Korea is already strong enough.
Yeah.
And they are in a security cooperation relationship. So in many ways, he sounds a lot like what Yoon used to be like and what Biden used to be like.
Yeah.
So he is trying to not look like Moon, basically. So that is one scenario. If Lee wins, the policy would sort of go down the road, at least during the campaign season. But if Yoon is impeached and PPP wins in a certain scenario, it's more unclear because there are 2 or 3 potential candidates with very unclear foreign policy.
And there hasn't really been coalescing of support behind one.
No, not really.
Candidate.
There have been a lot of factional infights within the People Power Party after impeachment, like we saw after Park Geun-hye impeachment. There are pro-Yoon factions, anti-Yoon factions, more centrist faction like Han Dong-un, the former PPP leader, while Oh Se-hun, the Seoul mayor, is saying that South Korea needs nuclear weapons immediately, while Han Dong-un is saying, maybe we just aim at nuclear latency. And now there is this all reports about the Department of Energy sort of having designated South Korea a sensitive country. The PPP infight has gone up, actually. So it's very unclear who will be selected in the primary.
And there's the labor secretary as well.
Kim Moon-soo is there in the polls, but to me, it looks like it's a reactionary sort of poll result because Kim Moon-soo got viral on social media after he defied the Democratic Party lawmakers asking the cabinet ministers to stand up and bow to apologize to the citizens. Kim was like, I'm not going to do that. So his approval rate went up, but then he kept saying that he doesn't want to run. He's very loyal to Yoon right now. So it's unclear if he's ever actually going to run. So those are 2 scenarios. And then if Yoon does not get impeached and reinstated, just a whole lot of black swan scenarios that we wrote about earlier this year would become a reality. It does not mean that all the martial law involved military commanders and everybody will just get off detention and just go back to their posts. It's not like that. The investigations will go on and the criminal case will still go on because the South Korean president does not get exemption to insurrection charges. But he will start his role as a president and the commander-in-chief immediately.
Wow.
But also, he, in order to assert his authority as a strong leader, he would try to show the South Korean society that there were enough South Korean national security threats when it comes to what he perceives as pro-China, pro-North Korea, or North Korean spies, rigging elections allegedly. Like he will try to prove it if he comes in, and North Korea will just wait and watch rather than providing justification.
And that could potentially put him out with the Trump administration if the White House is trying to do some sort of diplomatic engagement with North Korea and the Yoon Suk-yeol
Also,
administration
having
is
an
against
erratic ally, it's a
Yeah.
big liability. Especially when someone whose reputation is tainted as a Democratic ally in the Indo-Pacific region, it would be a big pressure for the U.S. administration to try to, treat Yoon the way they did before. The only time that Trump really mentioned Yoon was to mention impeachment issues.
Yeah.
So it would be a big pressure.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. That's a wonderful rundown. Any other thoughts from our panel? Yeah,
Yeah,
Shreyas.
well, to be honest, just building off that last point, and I think it also ties into what we were talking about earlier during Chad's session. Fundamentally, we were talking about Trump potentially reaching out to Kim Jong-un, and you mentioned that Korea, Japan, and the US appear to be in lockstep on the issue of denuclearization, at least. But there are a lot of questions right now about the future of this alliance. It's not the same as when you had Biden, Yoon, and Kishida very much on the same page. At this point, Trump is a wild card who certainly has a proven track record of trying to go his own way. You have Yoon, we don't know whether he's going to be around, but also, is he going to be a reliable partner, someone the US would want to trust? And Ishiba, at the end of the day, he's part of a system that has a long history of one-year prime ministers. So we don't really know where the alliance will be a year from now. So will there be that consistent push for cooperation against North Korean threats, or against for denuclearization? That's something that I think, honestly, a lot will depend on what comes out of Yoon's trial and whoever comes next, whether it's Yoon again, whether it's Lee Jae-myung, whether it's someone else.
Or someone
how
else
they-
in the DP.
Yes, or someone else in the DP. How they approach Trump, because at this point, no one seems to have a clear strategy
Right.
beyond saying, okay, let's try to at least be in his good books and say what he.
Right.
what
And
he
how
wants to do.
does, let's say there is an alignment, right, with a Lee Jae-myung presidency pushing for rapprochement with North Korea, how does South Korea insert itself into its process, into that process this time around? President Donald Trump and Kim Jong-un already have the relationship. And last time, there's the perception that Moon Jae-in set up some unrealistic expectations before Hanoi that led to problems, right? So how can South Korea be productive going forward?
I
into
don't
that?
think it can. I don't think.
I don't think it's willing to either.
Yeah, and the North Koreans wouldn't be interested in having South Korea as part of any negotiation at this point. So I think South Korea will be an onlooker of whatever happens between the US and DPRK.
Yeah.
I think it also came from I think the main difference between former President Moon Jae-in and the Democratic Party leader Lee Jae-myung is that they have different ideological backgrounds. Maybe they come from similar time in South Korea during democratization or whatnot, but they, as a political career, their background's different. Lee Jae-myung is not the typical Democratic Party sort of lineage of Kim Dae-jung, Roh Moo-hyun, and there are other more traditional people in the party like Kim Bu-kyung, former prime minister under Moon. There's also Kim Dong-yeon, the Gyeonggi governor. There are people who sound more like Moon when it comes to thinking about South Korea's role on the Korean Peninsula, like as a mediator, as a stakeholder.
Right.
Part of who has direct impact after the Korean War. But Lee Jae-myung does not, his rhetorics are not like that. When Moon was trying to insert himself into, like, in between, US and North Korea, so when they were doing summits, the term that he used is a driver of the Korean Peninsula affairs. To have a sense of autonomy and sovereignty, you have a voice, right?
Yeah.
But Lee Jae-myung does not use any of the terms that Moon used to use, and he only describes U.S.-North Korea issue as part of a bigger chessboard game, sort of, geopolitical, greater powers having their own calculations, and what can South Korea get out of it is, I think, how Lee Jae-myung sort of perceives.
And I wonder if that kind of maps onto the electorate's thinking, because of course, especially younger people in South Korea these days, less interested in warm and fuzzies with North Korea than in the past, and also have the same sort of reservations about China that the conservatives do as well. So there's been a bit of a sea change within the traditional demographic that supports the Democratic Party. So maybe he's maneuvering to kind of get those votes. What do you think?
At the end of the day, I think the priority calculation for him is what voters want and what the centrist voters want, swing voters want. And like you mentioned, younger generations increasingly do not really care for unification in a manner that, Moon administration or older generation used to think, like compatriotism, like in one country, we have to reunify, renew, and whatnot. But also, in general, because after North Korea said that they want to abandon unification, there's no really pragmatic reality that sort of aligns with any of those ideological sort of goals. So it does look like Democratic Party in general is sort of moving away from official party line of seeking, reunification more proactively. I think they're slowly moving away from it, but because there are still people in the 40s and 50s that they want engagement, they wouldn't say as far as we don't want unification anymore. But they would just very generically sort of not touch on the topic too much.
Yeah, interesting because when you poll North Korean refugees, they're very much in favor of unification, and of course, the government of North Korea has completely abandoned that policy goal. And then South Korea is constitutionally required to try to pursue unification, and they do that politically in very, very different ways. But of course, the South Korean people have largely given up interest in unification. So just interesting mismatch there
Kind of
on
jaded,
both ends.
really.
And what were we saying earlier, how that would be almost an avenue to getting on the same page if South Korea could politically abandon unification. A part of that threat from that North Korea, that Pyongyang feels, could be reduced.
Right. And so we're going to get into that question later on because one of our audience members asked us about that. And Colin, thanks for chiming in because we're going to get to you now. So you've done some really interesting articles using state media, pictures, and satellite imagery to tell us some really interesting things about what North Korea is doing, developing in the military realm and economically in terms of bridges being built to both China and Russia. That's symbolic, right? Both bridges are now under construction. And then some pretty significant progress in terms of construction of drones, a hidden base on a golf course. So can you walk us through what you've been, and then the nuclear submarine, of course, really interesting one. So can you take us through some of these?
Yeah, thanks. So I mainly do satellite imagery stuff at NK News, and you framed it correctly. I mean, I find that it's a really useful way to find out what's going on whenever things are so closed off, and even tourists aren't going into the country as much anymore. There's a lot less that you can find out about the country, but through satellite imagery, I'm checking all this stuff like military and economic stuff. So yeah, on the military side, actually. So a few notes that I have. So drones is one thing. This is sort of like a prestige thing at this point. North Korea is trying to show that they are on the same level as their adversaries, the U.S. They're copying U.S. drones to the T, like this. This is a Global Hawk drone, basically, that they've copied. And they're improving them. They're still building larger ones. This is from just last month, or in January. So there's no indication yet that they're building these things that they have a large production capacity. Same with a lot of weapons. But they have showed us that Kim has this 5-year military plan from 2021 through the beginning of next year. And they've proven to us that he's serious about it, that they have the ability to get the machinery that they need to build this stuff, that they can get the funding. But a lot of it is not mass produced yet. Some of it kind of is, like short-range ballistic missiles. Just going down the line, the smaller drones is one thing where I would say there's no reason to not expect that they will be mass producing these sometime in the next few years, and then that becomes an export issue to consider. Right now, I'm looking at one factory through satellite imagery where I think that is a good candidate for where they want to build these kinds of suicide drones, smaller drones. And this photo is where they showed us like more than 10 different models that they're thinking about making or that they're saying they're going to make. But this factory that I'm looking at, the progress is slow. They're not really building it yet. It's stalled. But maybe they're building them in other places. We don't know the full picture. But yeah, I mean, the point is we can kind of watch their progress on this stuff. And this is one thing that could become like their short-range ballistic missiles where, yeah, they're able to produce them. They're getting help maybe from Russia. That's not proven, but it's widely suspected. And then they'll be exporting them to who knows, smaller customers around the world that are engaged in their own wars. North Korea could be proliferating this kind of stuff to them. So the submarine, they promised to build a nuclear-powered submarine for many, many years. It's something that we expect is a slow project, but the questions on the naval reactor is unclear. Experts in the open source, it's unclear where they would be developing this or how far along they would be developing this, whether it's at the Jeongmin nuclear complex, the main nuclear complex. But they have yet to prove this stuff. This is the first time they showed us images of this sub, and they only showed us a little sliver of it last week. So this is one of the things where it's kind of a slow project. And the threat of this and being able to launch ballistic missiles, nuclear missiles from this thing, kind of many years in the future. So it's not an immediate issue for adversaries like South Korea and U.S.
And just to unpack the nuclear-powered sub, so why that's so important, right? Much more quiet than their current submarines, and a big advancement towards the nuclear triad, which would be very, very frightening.
Right, and I've heard experts on the subject tell me that it's not an expectation that this would be a quiet sub, that it would get out of port and be non-tracked. And if they're only building one of these things right now, and then they won't have another one for a while, it's kind of considered. One person wrote for us recently, Joost Olimans. He wrote for us, I think, like last week or something, and he wrote that it's not. It's more like a prestige project for now.
Okay.
Not going to be a major nuclear threat, but I don't know. And then, yeah, you just because you mentioned this, it's a. I don't know if we need to really get into a lot of detail about, but they built a missile test site or a missile launch site, long-range missiles, and they made it kind of look like a golf course. So it raises a bunch of questions about who are they trying to fool? Is it just because Kim Jong-un wants a nice-looking garden to launch its missiles from? There's a lot of kind of detailed questions in there or topics about their launch capabilities for long-range missiles, and I don't know if we want to get into all that right now, but
and some interesting
synchrony. It's fun to find this stuff.
Yeah, no, it's fascinating. Yeah. And
they surely didn't fool you.
Well, that's the thing. I don't think that they're trying to have a secret missile base because it's easily found by, especially probably U.S. intelligence, for example. So it raises questions, though.
It's an interesting synchrony because, of course, the THAAD ballistic missile defense battery was built on top of an old golf course, right? So perhaps some
That's funny.
posturing there.
There you go. It's a message. But about missile defense, to talk about the long-range missiles, where they're constantly challenging the U.S.'s supposed missile defense system that they have guarding against North Korean ICBMs. And constantly, it's like a numbers game. If they have their multiple warhead missiles and they're building more of them, then suddenly the math shows that the existing U.S. Missile defense systems cannot defeat those missiles. And then and it's very expensive for the U.S. To develop this missile defense system. So that's an area where North Korea has just shown that they're able to move past the U.S.'s defense capability. But it's like China has more than enough missiles to defeat the U.S. The U.S. didn't even try in that case. So this is just an existing missile test base that we look at in satellite imagery. And if we look at it in satellite imagery, maybe we can see signs that they're preparing for another missile test. I don't call them those missile test provocations because I just know that they're developing these technologies, and that's kind of where they're at right now. They're testing these missiles to test their capability to launch, not in order to necessarily get a rise from the U.S. or South Korea. Yeah. Sometimes they do frame it that way. And back to the subject on Russia, Kim Jong-un showed very clearly his interest in a lot of Russian technologies. It doesn't mean that Kim is here he is looking at Russian jets. Here he is with Putin looking at Russian satellite launch vehicles. It hints at this kind of cooperation, which is going to probably continue, I think, regardless of whether the war stops. And so I just wanted to mention that because of what you said earlier.
Excellent.
You wanted to publicly disagree.
No. the warships
with evidence.
Yeah.
North Korean warships is a topic that I think can be slightly a game changer in the coming years, because they've promised to have these warships constantly deployed on the East and West Seas with anti-air missiles that threaten U.S. spy flights, and they promised to shoot these down. So they're probably going to up the ante in the next couple of years and say you're not allowed to fly over our territorial waters, which is actually international waters, and then they'll try to enforce that rule, and the U.S. can choose whether or not they want to challenge that. I find that a very interesting
and the Northern Limit Line, where they've come out publicly contesting South Korea's version of the border. That's an area where everyone has their eyes just
lots of
on the
GPS
lookout.
jamming going on over there at the moment.
Is there?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Although they said that they will fix the constitution to reflect that, but they didn't do it yet.
And they did not, right? That was kind of weird.
I think it's
personally.
Yeah.
disputed. They hinted that they did and that they didn't put it in the public reports, but that it was done, the
Okay.
constitutional revision.
Because that was a Kim Jong-un demand. You better change the constitution, change the unification policy, and also this NLL border stuff.
Yeah.
I do
Territorial
decree.
clauses.
And then we didn't see a public official confirmation of here's what the new
Right.
constitution looks
Maybe
like.
it was meant to be vague.
Yeah.
I don't know if these warships will be meant to challenge the NLL, but they'll be meant to probably challenge the U.S. Flying their surveillance planes
Right.
over the seas on each coast.
And that has been a target in the past, right? They have shot down a U.S. surveillance plane.
Yes, many decades ago, I think. But and then on the economic side, I also find it very useful to check this stuff because while we talk about the mysteries about the China relation with North Korea, and there's all these open questions about, well, the trade keeps going on, and well, is China actually upset with North Korea? Well, China went ahead and built out their huge. Let's see if I can get this to work. I don't know what that is. Okay. Well, the one on the left is the Chinese customs at this bridge that China built over 10 years ago and they never opened because North Korea didn't even build a road to connect to it. So China was very eager back then. And then cut to the pandemic, China showed their eagerness by upgrading their customs port on the left. And this bridge is still not open, by the way. And now in the last couple of weeks, North Korea started to work on this large area on the right in the yellow box. And that's kind of a signal, I think, to North Korea warming to this idea of boosting trade with China. And anyway, it's an example of where you can find these clues when neither side are saying much in the open. You can find these clues to where they are,
Right.
showing that they'll be working together soon. And then I don't want to forget the subject of human rights because North Korea is upgrading 4 different prison camps at the moment. These are prisons which are for ordinary crimes. They're called ordinary prison camps, not like the long-term lifetime prison camps. You can come into these and then leave once you served your time. And they're upgrading them like this, so you can see the difference there. The question is this going to result in better cell conditions for prisoners? Is it because they want to put more people in prison? These are questions which are hard to answer, but I also think that this comes back to a bigger issue about Kim Jong-un, his priorities on cracking down on the population, on trying to get everyone under the same umbrella in terms of his ideology. That's another big focus right now that I think we cannot forget. Looking
Super.
forward to the next few years. So.
Yeah, great work. Thank you so much, Colin, for sharing all that. And
Thanks.
for the sake of time, I want to proceed right ahead to Shreyas. Shreyas, thank you for being so patient and waiting. And we're going to have the luck to hear from you about North Korean state media propaganda. And I prompted you to kind of discuss this in 2 buckets.
Yeah.
One bucket would be propaganda aimed at normal folks within North Korea. What are the messaging that's happening right now? And then what kind of messaging is going out for external consumption? What kind of messages is North Korea saying right now?
Yeah, so I think, as you rightly point out, with North Korea, the messaging tends to shift a lot depending on the audience. And with domestic audiences, we've seen a few things in particular stand out in recent times, particularly over the past year or so. One major theme has been economic development. Now, over the past few years, we've definitely seen and heard Kim Jong-un talking about the country's economic problems, shedding tears to show that how he feels about the people's plight, talking about natural disasters affecting the economy and the people's lives. But over the past year or so, it has been more about course correction, trying to emphasize what they're doing right. So one big part of it has been housing. So it has been something that's followed on since the 2021 Party Congress, where they unveiled plans to build 50,000 houses in the Pyongyang area. And they've been unveiling these massive projects, something Colin has been actively following, actually reporting on, with these apartment blocks that are popping up all over the area, and essentially he's saying, I'm going to improve your lives. Housing has been a big problem for a long time, and we're improving that now. Essentially, it's coming from me. The second part has been beyond Pyongyang, particularly over the past year or so. There has been an emphasis on regional development, trying to improve the situation in areas that have long been neglected. So it's essentially what he calls the 2010 Regional Development Initiative. The idea is to develop various cities, various regions across the country, build new factories, build new facilities, and raise the standard of living. But interestingly, while state media goes on and on about the successes of these projects, the progress that they're making, from the start there was an interesting theme where he tried to set himself apart from his predecessors. He effectively criticized the economic policy that North Korea has been following for decades, which earlier was unthinkable. I mean, for all practical purposes, for most of his reign, Kim Jong-un has, at least on paper, been outranked by two dead men, his father and his grandfather. And over the past year or so, we've seen him try to step out of their shadow a bit more. And the economic projects, fundamentally being what affects citizens' lives, are the biggest factors among those. But at the same time, there's certainly other signs of him kind of starting to develop his own cult of personality to rival his predecessors. So that includes, for example, the annual festivals in honor of his grandfather and father, the Day of the Sun, for Shining Sun, for example, for the Day of the Sun for his grandfather. That's something that is the country's biggest holiday, but we saw very little in state media in terms of mentions of that particular term. They started using things like the April Spring Festival to just commemorate the events. There were still a few cases of official recognition of the old name, but that was perhaps minimized, and it helped downplay the significance of his grandfather, the founder of North Korea, and instead helped set a stage where Kim Jong-un can rise to an equivalent level. So we're seeing domestically signs of that
Do
cult
we
of
know how
personality.
these messages are being received by ordinary folks?
Well, I mean, I think fundamentally it's hard to really get information out of North Korea. There are anecdotal reports. Most of the defectors who are now coming to South Korea actually left years ago, so we can't say that they're the best indicator of what things are like at the moment. But certainly there would be, I think in the country, Kim Il-sung always had a particularly high position in the country. I think it would perhaps stand out as unusual to people that if his position is being downplayed. Kim Jong-il is perhaps a different matter. He was exalted, but at the same time, he oversaw one of the worst famine in North Korea's history. People do have some unpleasant memories of him.
Right.
So I think they wouldn't. I think by the time he came to power, they weren't as blinded by that worship of the leader that he is unquestionably divine.
Right.
Absolutely perfect. So I think there might be some skepticism in some areas when it comes to Kim Jong-un, but at the same time, it is certainly going to be effective enough for him.
And how about the external messaging?
So the external messaging, I think a big part of it has been, and I think we've kind of discussed when it comes to the US, South Korea, and Japan in particular, fundamentally, they are enemies. The position right now is North Korea is not interested in talking to them. North Korea is certainly not interested in their idea of denuclearization, firmly rejects any calls from them for denuclearization. And at the same time, it is framing them as the biggest nuclear threat in the region. So it's using these three countries to justify its own military developments, tell the people, on one hand, we need to be able to deter these threats. That's why we're continuing to develop these weapons. And at the same time, it sends a message to them that we're not to be messed with. We can fight back if needed. So I think with those three countries, there's a bit of that approach. And with the US in particular, there was until late last year, people were saying, will he be friendly with Trump, given their personal relationship? But end of the year, they made it very clear at an end-of-year party plenum, Kim Jong-un unveiled what state media described as their most hostile anti-US policy. And so I think for now, at least, the message is we're not interested in talking. Maybe, who knows, depending on how things play out in the next year or two, might change. But for now, not interested.
And we've certainly seen Kim Yo-jong say that raising the bar for what negotiations should be, basically saying denuclearization is off the table.
Pretty much.
Wonderful. So let's pivot to our audience questions. So I'll invite Chelsea Alexander to come on in. And I see we already have one from our in-person audience. So I'll just invite everyone to be brief as you can. Identify yourself, and then our panelists too. Hopefully we can get to a bunch of these questions. We have some virtual and hopefully lots in person, and we like to privilege our in-person audience because you took the time to come here despite the rain. So I see Sean itching to go. Chelsea, over to you.
So I'll turn it over to Sean. We'll get a mic over to him there.
Happy St. Patrick's Day. Maybe just because I'm Irish American, I got the first question. As for North Korea not wanting to deal with the U.S., it's always darkest before the dawn. And speaking on St. Patrick's Day, I remember just before it was ready for talks with Britain, the IRA threw missiles on the runway at Heathrow, just to say that if it was going to talk, it was going to talk on its own terms. So if President Trump had thought through the impeachment of Yoon Suk-yeol, which I was hoping we would know by today, so today would be a sort of more informed discussion, he would probably think that the impeachment was in his favor, because then Lee Jae-myung or whoever from the Minju would favor his rapprochement with North Korea. But Elbridge Colby in his confirmation hearings talked about favorably OPCOM transfer, which obviously somebody from the DP would look favorably upon. But has the recent martial law declaration and everything that's followed shown us that South Korea is not ready for prime time and that OPCON really should be off the table for now?
Good question.
Thank you.
I'll take a stab at this. I would guess yes. Fundamentally, I agree with your question. I think from the South Korean conservatives, PPP, they tend to prefer kicking the can down the road when it comes to OPCON transfer. It tends to be the DP who are seeking it. But especially after what we've seen with the drone incident, there were we forget about the first drone incident, December 2022, when the North Korean drones came in and Yoon said, we're going to send them back. He did. Those things were done without coordination with the US, and those things could have triggered serious conflict or escalation. And I just don't think South Korea has proven itself to be a reliable ally and partner, responsible partner when it comes to some of its adventuristic approaches to dealing with the DPRK recently.
Just to give some context here, if OPCON transfer would go through, that would put the U.S. in a position where it could get sucked into a conflict from South Korean initiative, whereas now a little bit more control over. And we saw that during the Cheonan sinking, the U.S. side putting some pressure on South Korea not to overreact.
Right.
Yeah, but it's also now conditions based, right? It shifted from years ago there was a timeline, and now it's like denuclearization has to happen. Like
favorable international environment, which is impossible, right? We'll never get that.
Can I just add something? So in the next few years, the civil-military relationship will be a very important topic in South Korea for the South Korean society and the politicians to really address and try to figure out. After the martial law, it was not just about the president having the authority to instruct generals to send units into the National Assembly, which was bad enough, but also afterwards the investigations showing that there were cases like the drone incursion. Also, there were notes related to potentially, striking regions in North Korea where the balloons were being launched, which is still contested, but still. So after seeing this, there is a massive mistrust among the South Korean public themselves about the South Korean military, because there were former generals who retired and became defense minister who were wielding informal authority over certain commanders and units. And imagine South Korea having the having transferred the wartime operational control. Will even the South Korean public trust the South Korean military to do that? So I think for DP, like a lot of people used to think that, oh, DP is certainly pro-OPCON, but it would be a lot of pressure for the DP right now as well to prove to the public that they can actually do it.
Right.
Well, I'm going to read a question we have from a TKS member that we received online. Terry Roig, lecturer at University of Wisconsin-Madison, asks if you have any further insights on North Korea's intentions in its dropping of the goal of reunification. So that's open to anyone who would like to answer.
Yeah. So, well, I think, as mentioned, I think to some extent a big part of it is North Korea has at least come to this conclusion that unification is not really feasible, it's not really possible. I think part of that is perhaps pragmatism. I think North Korea and South Korea have fundamentally different views of what unification means, or at least what the end result will be, who will be in charge when it goes through. But the other part is they also do not see whoever's in charge in South Korea as a reliable partner, as someone they can actually deal with, as someone they can trust to make things happen. So I think a lot of these factors, particularly exacerbated by everything that has happened since Hanoi, has made them kind of lose a little faith in both the US and South Korea. Not that they had much faith to begin with, but that's kind of shaped the view. For the moment, they certainly have no reason to do it. I think the other factor, though, is we've seen a bit of indecision, perhaps, on how they want to implement this. We saw right off the bat, they pretty much demolished inter-Korean symbols in North Korea. They removed a lot of inter-Korean symbols and organizations, media outlets. But in the last, and they said, we're not really interested in South Korea. But at the same time, sometimes they go to straight up hostility, and sometimes they seem a little uncertain about how they want to approach South Korea. For example, with the Yoon Suk-yeol martial law situation, each time they took a little time to decide how they were going to react, and usually they did it through the lens of some other media, through foreign media or some other situation. So it seems like they're still trying to figure out what they really want to do when they detach from engagement with South Korea. So it might take a while before we reach the stage where there's some clarity there.
It's also, it's not my idea, I must have read it from someone, but the idea that it's a domestic choice to take away the strange discrepancy when people are learning, what is it, like the North Korean people are learning to uphold the idea of unification with our South Korean brothers, and yet demonizing them at the same time. So Kim Jong-un wanted to take that away.
Theological burden.
Yeah, he wants to
Incoherency.
be able to focus on South Korea as the enemy, not this strange contradiction between them being our brothers and our enemies.
And
Useful
building
for
tactical
him.
weapons, nuclear weapons to target
Right,
them.
right. Useful for him to justify the totalitarian control.
Yeah.
We'll turn it back to our in-person audience. I see someone right up here. If you want to get a mic up here.
Hi, my name is Craig. That submarine, do we have one that size? Do the Chinese, do the Russians? That really looks like an outlier, at least compared to World War II era. But
I'm not sure about how the size compares, and there's like estimates. I think someone estimated like 11 meters diameter, but I'm sure it's not as big or as capable as anything that the U.S. has. And the U.S. has multiple of these SSBNs, and North Korea is looking at having one for the foreseeable 5-10 years. So yes, I think it would be a useful weapon, not as advanced as the ones the U.S. has, for example. But
And one U.S. nuclear-powered sub can
launch
carry
dozens.
more,
How many nuclear warheads?
up to I think over
100,
150.
yeah.
But they never do.
Multiple,
They're
right,
capable of
right.
doing that, which is more nuclear weapons than North Korea has. In
Yeah, and
total.
there's also a question about what this sub is intended to carry. The analysis on our site by a contributor recently said, based on the language in North Korea's report, it was only one sentence, but it suggested guided missiles, suggesting cruise missiles, and if we don't even know yet if they are intending to have, long-range ballistic missiles on this submarine.
Right. So the cruise missile is good for overcoming the ballistic missile
It's
defense.
just part of the triad. It's one more what they hope would be undetectable way to get a missile off. But yeah, it doesn't look like it's challenging the U.S. level of a SSBN at the moment.
So we've got another question from online. Arius Durr at KEI asks, what is the biggest disconnect between how DC views the situation in Korea right now compared to your observations in Seoul, since you guys are based there?
I'll just say one very small thing on this, which is I think those in the Beltway I speak to or see on social media tend to view the DP, Democratic Party, as pro-North Korea, or they associate them with the sort of student protest days and an ideology that was very anti-US, and that's just simply not the case anymore. Like Lee Jae-myung is not that kind of, as Jeongmin was saying, he's not like, he doesn't have that ideological bent that Moon Jae-in had. So for me, that's
Moon was responsible for a lot of military build-up.
Right. Yeah.
I mean, there are still some people like that in the DP or DP-related figures. Like, there are still those people. But Lee Jae-myung, while he was working on the general election last year, these people did not get 공천, the nominations for the lawmaker seating. So a lot of them are not in the supreme sort of, the commission in the party. So a lot of them actually lost political power. So it's not like nobody's there. But the mainstream in the DP, like you mentioned, is not like the traditional DP that we saw before.
Yeah, and fundamentally, I think quite often people look at even the more progressive leaders of the DP has had the former presidents, Kim Dae-jung, Moon Jae-in, Roh Moo-hyun. Sometimes this narrative paints it as if a progressive leader is elected, he's going to cater to China's needs. He's going to pretty much walk away from US engagement. And I don't think that has ever really happened. South Korea, or Korea itself, has not been a Chinese vassal state since the 19th century, irrespective of leader. And every president who comes in, conservative or liberal, has to balance those two major powers, the US and China. There's a greater economic weight with China historically, maybe not so much at the moment, whereas the US has been South Korea's most important security partner. So they all have to balance it, just the proportion of that balance varies.
Just one more quick thing. A lot of, we're talking about conventional wisdom in DC that are sometimes proven wrong, right? One of those things is, this idea that the desire for nuclear armament is a conservative thing in South Korea. Sure, there are a lot of conservative factions in South Korea within the People Power Party. Na Kyung-won, Oh Se-hoon, a lot of these people who are like very high profile, you would talk about that publicly, but it's less about just being conservative, but it's more about nationalists. Like there are nationalists who are in the Conservative Party. There are also nationalists within the Progressive Democratic Party that would privately talk about like nuclear latency options.
Yeah.
So it's less driven by ideological difference between the two parties, but more on like external threat perception that would like give certain platforms for these politicians to actually talk about.
I just add one in terms of North Korea, and that's from working at Daily NK, and from having a lot of friends who are North Korean defectors or refugees who left North Korea. Sometimes what get lost in the U.S. version of the conversation about what's happening in North Korea is this texture of the dynamism of the change and the factions within North Korea, and in particular, the state and society of relationship, which we have so many great resources to try to understand, but you need the Korean language skills in order to really get into that discussion. So sometimes I find that texture is lacking, and it's a shame because, when we're evaluating Kim Jong-un as a leader and the things that he's trying to do, understanding how his messages are received by different, because he does have constituencies, very narrow constituencies, right? But he does have those channels that he's looking to placate. So I feel like that's lost sometimes.
And we'll take another question from our in-person audience. Itai, right here.
Thank you for a very interesting presentation. I teach at John Jay College.
Can you speak a little louder, please?
I teach at John Jay College. Thanks for the presentation. My name is Itai. A 3-part question, quick. Is there going to be any experiments done by North Korea anytime soon? Is South Korea developing a nuclear program? And is South Korea getting stronger relationship with Taiwan, given all the risks involved? Thank you.
Okay, big 3-parter to close it out. Take any aspect of the question that's interesting to you.
So the first part was, is North Korea going to do a nuclear test anytime soon? I don't think so. I think they would wait until give it a year or two, see if Trump is going to provide any outreach, and maybe use that as leverage later if the North Korea portfolio is just entirely overlooked.
I'll answer the second question. South Korea is currently, as far as I know, not developing nuclear weapons, but there has been a lot of discussion between high-profile lawmakers about retaining the nuclear latency option, and the model that the South Koreans are looking at is Japanese model, but that is also sort of based on lack of knowledge about what Japanese society is like and what their feelings about nuclear weapons is like. But from South Korean nationalist politicians' point of view, Japan has the option to go nuclear very quickly if they wanted to, because they retain the latency option. So that is like one of the latest developments in South Korea. But although like President Yoon himself also discussed the idea of how South Korea can technologically very capable of building nuclear weapons very quickly, as far as I know, it hasn't happened yet.
There's no reprocessing or enrichment capabilities in South Korea, and under the NPT and additional protocol, I think politically they would struggle to get that after a president has said that they are interested in developing nuclear weapons.
And even with conservatives in South Korea, they would sort of frame nuclear armament option even as saying something that would require a trust and agreement from the US side. Good luck with that.
And they don't have natural sources of uranium, et cetera, for fissile material. And presumably, if they were to just go ahead and proceed, they get kicked out of the nuclear suppliers group, right? And so their access would be imperiled, not only for the weapons development, but also for the civilian nuclear energy program, which is a big source of export revenue for them as well. So all that could come under threat. Okay, so why don't I invite our audience to please give our wonderful panelists a round of applause. Great job. Learned so much. So keep an eye on NK News and Korea Pro for all the insights there. We're back again virtually on March 26th, U.S.-Korea-Japan relations. So hope you join us for that. And then in person, we're back again April 30th with Ankit Panda doing his new book about nuclear proliferation. Nice. So come back in person for that. We are a membership organization, so we do appreciate you considering to join up as members. So if you're interested in that, we do have staff on hand who can help you with that process. We have student membership starting at $25. So it's really great, and you should be a member of the Korea Society. For coming in person today, we would like to give you some dumplings. So thank you so much for coming in person. Hang out with us, chat with our wonderful speakers, and we'll look forward to seeing you here again soon at the Korea Society. Thanks, everybody. Have a great day.